Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. For 2 years, Chile's youth have taken to the streets calling for equality and free university education. Now with the November 17th general elections coming up, today we ask, what impact have these protests had on the country's next president? Filling in for Malika Bilal is our digital producer, Julio Ricardo Varela. As you can tell from his name, perfectly suited
that was awesome
to today's conversation.
Yes.
So you're looking out for our online conversation,
Yes.
both in English and in Spanish.
Yes.
What do you see?
We're seeing a lot of students are actually tweeting us and also sending us video comments. And I just want to play one from Pablo that gives you sort of the overall issue that's going on in Chile. So here's Pablo.
In my opinion, the demands of young Chileans will be crucial not only in Sunday's election, but for the entire government of Michelle Bachelet, the sure winner of these elections. The relevant points will be two: free quality education for the whole population and the enactment of a new constitution without the moorings of the constitution of Pinochet.
Remember, you can tweet us throughout the show using the hashtag AJStream.
So before we get started, the stream is a show that's driven by you. So let us know if you have a suggestion for a future program. And it's really easy to do. All you have to do is go to facebook.com/AJStream and your idea could be in the stream.
I'm Shalina Jan Mohammed and I'm the author of Love in a Headscarf and I'm in the stream.
Chileans are preparing to head to the polls on Sunday as 9 presidential candidates vie for their vote. Former President Michelle Bachelet is holding a substantial lead and expected to win. One of the main issues she is set to tackle are calls for education reform that have swept the country for the last couple of years. Since 2011, Chile's student protests have consumed the country as demands for the right to free higher education have grown. Now, although current President Sebastián Piñera has slashed student loan interest rates, protests continue. And now youth demonstrations have expanded to include a more equal society and a new constitution. So, on the cusp of election day, what impact will these calls for change have on the country's next president, if any at all? Joining us via Skype from Santiago to help us talk about this, we have Giorgio Jackson, who's a parliamentary candidate with the Democratic Revolutionary Movement. He is one of a number of student activists running for Congress. In our Google Plus Hangout, Gregory Alacqua is director of the Public Policy Institute. His research focuses on education policy, school choice and public opinion. And student leader Valentina Olivares, she's also with the student movement Una Nacional Estudiante. So it's great to have you all here in the stream. Let me just start first of all with Giorgio. Giorgio, welcome back to the stream, I should say. The last time we saw you, 2011, student activist, now student politician. You are running for office. What to you is the most critical issue?
Well, I think that we can address this issue from 2 points of view. I think that from the political point of view, I think that Pablo, who sent a video, he hit the right point. I mean, the constitution of our country is a heritage of the Pinochet dictatorship. So I think that if we want to think about the future, we must change that constitution and build a new one, because that one was created under with no democratic system. But from the point of view of the citizens, I think that the country is anxious to have less mistrust from the politicians. I think that today the mistrust has taken the political scenario, and I think that mistrust it has to be taken by a new political practices, not the same politicians that goes to the re-elections 5 or 6 times.
Right, so Giorgio, you say this, but you are also running for office, so you can't talk about other politicians anymore. You've got to talk about what you're going to do, right?
Yes, of course.
What's your plan?
We're trying to build new political practices, and we're putting just in the campaign, we have no companies or enterprise donations to the campaign. We have transparency protocols that no one else has. So we're trying to make things different, and I think the population has seen these new practices, and we have a lot of support.
Trying to make things different, isn't that what every politician says? Valentina, did you have something to say?
Well, I agree with Paolo and also with Giorgio with the main demands and the agenda that the social movements have created. That has great tasks. First of all, the recovery of all social rights that are today commodified. The recovery of our main resources, main natural resources such as copper and water that are today in hands of foreign and national privates, right? And the recovery of our democracy. And in that point, I agree that there's a giant mistrust in the political class nowadays in Chile. But our task is not only to create new practices, but to create a new political project that can replace.
You know when somebody says, Valentina, you know when somebody says new practices, what do you mean by new practices? It's so general, and you've been out demonstrating for 2 years. What do you mean by new practices?
My interpretation of new practices is ending with representative democracy and installing a profound democratic system based on participative democracy.
Wow.
Right?
Are we talking revolution here? A major overhaul?
Yes.
That's what it sounds like.
Yes, it has to be started by a new constitution, such as Giorgio said, but it has a detail, a very important detail.
Right.
This new constitution cannot be resolved inside the walls of the actual parliament, right?
All right.
It has to be created by the whole citizenship, by a constitutional assembly or a constitutional process. That's what, from our point of view, is the best way to create a new democracy.
All right, Julio.
Speaking of the distrust issue that we're hearing, we have a tweet from people that don't agree with President Bachelet, and let me read it. It's in Spanish.
She's not a president yet.
Not yet. Yes,
I think
candidate.
Julio
Bachelet.
just called the election.
No, I didn't. So, I did not call the election. But anyway,
you heard it here first.
So anyway, the talk about President Bachelet is
former
President Bachelet is saying that she will win via her progressive action vision. This comes from Latino News. And the Chilean conservative movement is divided and weakened after Piñera. So my question for Gregory, is it that overwhelming for that support for the candidate Bachelet, or is this a done deal?
I think it is a done deal, and I think while there is overwhelming support for Bachelet, especially among low-income and kind of emerging middle-class groups, some of the groups that supported Piñera, the question is whether they're going to turn out to vote. And I think it is a concern for Chilean democracy, a weakened right-wing coalition as well. I mean, you want to have strong parties, strong institutions, so it does concern me that we're going to have such an overwhelming landslide for the institutions on the right as well.
What's your take on Bachelet, Gregory? How do you see her? You spent a lot of time working in education, with education reform. You've worked with other administrations. How do you see her?
I see Bachelet as a very charismatic candidate who's kind of trying to take the pulse of the citizenry, and she's clearly reading the demands correctly. The student demands, as Pablo, Giorgio, and Valentina mentioned, are free higher education, a new constitution, deep political reforms. My concern with some of these demands was I agree with some of them, is how to go about doing them. Chile, we have to remember in the context, has been a success story outside of Chile. Sometimes I think Chile is a victim of its own success. Chile moved from the 7th richest country in the region to the 1st richest country over the last 20 years. Chile it decreased poverty rates, increased levels of education. Currently we have education coverage similar to industrialized OECD countries.
Right.
So I think we need to remember that Chile in many ways has been a success story. So what we need to do is embark on a new set of reforms, ambitious reforms, that continue our path to success, reduce inequality, decrease poverty, increase democracy. I agree with all of the things Valentina and Giorgio said, but I'm concerned about what they're proposing. How do we actually reach those? I think they're the devils in the details.
Sure, Giorgio.
Yes, Femi. there's one thing that I think that is important not only in Chile, all around the world, because yes, probably we have good big numbers, but those big numbers don't let us see beyond the inequality that is. For example, do you think that the U.S. is an unequal country?
I think most people would say yes, to some extent,
Okay,
yes.
well, Chile, in one index, the 1% index, we have almost double the inequality. For the 1% of the population in Chile takes a third of the income. So that's the double almost of the index of the U.S.
Georgia, the U.S. is Georgia. Just to say, the U.S. is not a good example. The U.S. 1%, if you take capital gains, takes about 25% of the income. But if we look at a country like France, the Netherlands,
it's even worse.
they're much more
Chile
equal
is even
countries.
worse than that.
Yes, I agree.
So, Giorgio, the point you're trying to make is?
Yes, the point is that we are always talking about our big numbers, but we're not seeing the whole population. I mean, the 95% of the population live in the doubt of not knowing how it's going to end the month. So I think that this is the main issue.
Sure.
Could I ask a question? Could I ask a question to Valentina and Giorgio?
Yeah.
I'm just curious how free higher education would help us achieve a more equal society when currently the 20% richest part of the population, almost all of them go on to college, whereas the 20% poorest, about 75%, do not go and enroll into an institution of higher education. So the free higher education proposal would be completely regressive and go in the opposite direction that Giorgio's suggestion. I agree with him. We have high levels of inequality.
So Gregory, you asked the question. Gregory, you asked the question. So Gregory, you asked the question. Let's keep it short so Valentina can actually answer it. Valentina?
Sure.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think the educational demands have been a gate to open several other critiques that not only involve the education as a promise of equality, right? We're talking about work conditions, we're talking about the democratic system, and all of that. I think it's a much wider program, the one that we should be discussing right now. First of all.
So let me bring in the community while you take a pause, Valentina.
Yes, one of the biggest issues that our community is talking about is, when you look at this, is also the issue of compulsory versus voluntary voting for the first time.
Right.
And so we asked that question about it in talking about the turnout, like who's going to come out on Sunday. And this is what Estrella O tweeted back to me, and she said, for sure, I foresee a decrease by the presence in the political process of the young, the poorer, and the less educated.
You know, Julio, do you know who we've just got joining us? So we have Lucia Newman, who has been reporting on the election campaigns. Lucia, this is a great question for you to kind of put some insight into. Now that voting is voluntary, who's going to turn out? That's what our online community want to know.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's a very interesting question. And shortly before I came here to the Quinta Normal, where I'm speaking to you from right now, and where very shortly Michelle Bachelet is going to hold her closing campaign rally, I noticed on Facebook's a lot of messages going back and forth, particularly from young people, saying, you've got to go out and vote, you've got to go out and vote. We can't allow anyone, i.e. Michelle Bachelet, to win in the first round, because that is simply going to increase the arrogance, they're saying, of whoever wins. In this case, according to the polls, it will be Michelle Bachelet. They're appealing to young people to come out and vote for the smaller candidates, even though they know they may not win, but at least to get the message across that there are other voices out there are other demands out there, and that they are important, and that young people have to make their voices heard, this time through the ballot box. So I don't know how successful that's going to be or not, but I'm rather surprised at the number of young people whom I've talked to who actually are planning to go out and vote.
All right.
Even though they don't have to this time.
Yeah, sure. So Giorgio, I mean, you're hoping that actually will happen for you. What do you think might persuade people not to get out and vote? Young people, students, for instance.
I think that the problem with participation, it doesn't solve with a good speech or with a final action in the last days, because it's a structural problem. The people doesn't believe. A big part of the population don't believe that voting will change things. So it's a kind of distrust of the system. So I'm working for people to get into the vote, but I know already that a great part of the population will not go into vote. So I'm prepared for that scenario, but I'm working to change it, not in the short term, but in the medium or long term.
So Valentina, when we talk about education reform in Chile, what does that actually mean? This is what you've been protesting about for so long.
It means not just more scholarships, yes, or more individual investments, such as Michelle Bachelet is offering right now, but it means the creation of a new public, free, quality, and democratic educational system from the primary going to secondary and to university studies, right? It means change the actual conception of education that in the past 20 or even 40 years has been conceived as an individual investment, as an individual wealth, instead of a social and collective right that should promote the overcome of the inequalities that were
Okay, Valentina, right? I'm really curious because Lucia is following this campaign. Lucia, you're across all of the candidates as best as you can be. Is anyone actually offering this up as something concrete as educational reform?
Yes.
Do they have good, strong policies? Let me ask Lucia that, Valentina, and then I'll come back to you.
I'm sorry, but
what are the candidates offering?
Well. It's
I understand.
Could you please repeat the last part of your question?
No, you're at a campaign rally, so I know you've got background information going on there.
You know, this. Sure.
So education reform, how high up is that on candidates' agendas?
For the first time ever, it's rather bizarre. Very high up, but that's what I was going to say. There are 9 candidates. Absolutely all of them, for the first time, have had to put education at the very, very top of their agendas. Whether they really plan to make it their priority, if and when they're elected, is another matter altogether. As you've been hearing all along, there are a lot of people who just simply don't believe in their politicians anymore. But, you know, the debate, the last debate, and more than half of the debate was about how unequally wealth is distributed in Chile and how there is so much segregation based on class and income. And the other half of the debate was on education. And all of them except one candidate, the conservative candidate, Evelyn Matei, promises to have free education, both secondary, from kindergarten to university school. They're all promising to do that. They're all saying they're going to do it in different ways. But these days, anybody who wants to be elected knows that they've got to at least make an effort to address this issue, because more than 70% of Chilean society is calling for it. It's not something that can be ignored.
Wow, that's definitely put a smile on Giorgio's face and Valentina's face. Giorgio, jump in very quickly, and then I really have to get back to community because they're chomping at the bit too. Giorgio.
What? Sorry, I didn't hear it.
Yes, you wanted to jump in there.
Oh yes, because Gregory asked a question about how will be a free education system for the richest, but we have to get back when we initiate those mobilizations, because when we talk about our tuition fees, that is from a minimum wage or to minimum wage, even more, we are talking about that people who less have doesn't have the possibility to go to university, and we have a structural problem in the primary and secondary system that doesn't allow people to go to the university. So it's not only free education at the higher level, but it's also a fair system in the primary and secondary. We agree on that, but how do we finance the higher education system is because of a tax reform. That's how we think that the higher people, the richest people, it's paying today less with the tuition fees that they should pay if they pay the right tax amount.
Okay.
Our community is also weighing in on a third issue that's going on in this election, and that has to do with the Constitution. And I know Giorgio brought it up before, and known as the Pinochet Constitution. And I just want to share a tweet from @RebelDiaz, who says, when we asked, is the Constitution going to change? He says, it should. See, as long as Pinochet's Constitution is being used, his legacy of torture and murder lives on. So, Gregory, I call it the Pinochet factor. It's 40 years since the coup. Is that still playing part in this election? Is there a factor still going on?
I mean, the Constitution was conceptualized, designed, and implemented during dictatorship. That's a fact. However, we have to also acknowledge that the current Constitution has had some benefits as far as the policymaking process. You have two stable coalitions, you have incremental change, and you also have a country, by all objective standards, though there's a lot of things that we need to still work on, that has decreased poverty, increased wealth, and slightly decreased inequality, although it's still at very unacceptable levels. So I think the problem with the Constitution is that it's not a competitive political process. So people do not feel that their politicians actually represent them and are responding to their demands. So therefore we have weak political institutions.
Giorgio, you're running for office. What do you think of your prospects? How are your polls doing?
I have a good support, but as Gregory said, there's kind of with the voluntary system, we don't know until the 17th.
Wow! Do you seriously? You're not feeling confident? You haven't ordered champagne for your post-campaign party?
No. I was working from 10 months ago until today. Today in the morning I was in the different part of the city, and it's important to work until the last day because nothing is sure until the last vote.
Wow. Okay.
I think if I could just say, I think that this is a great thing. The voluntary system actually makes the politicians have to work for their votes and do a get out the vote, and just like Giorgio's done so successfully, and hopefully he's successful. I think the voluntary vote system, although there's a lot of debate around it, I think one positive thing about it is it makes the system more competitive, and it makes politicians have to really work for their votes.
Now, you've been watching Lucia Newman. She's our Al Jazeera English correspondent. She's been covering the Chile elections, the campaigns for us. You may or may not know that Lucia is Chilean. She is from Chile. So, Lucia, personally, for you, what has it been like?
Yeah. Well, actually, what I wanted to say, I know Giorgio. I know him very well. I covered him when he was a student leader when these student protests first began. They first began 8 years ago when Bachelet first took power, when they were secondary school students, and then they became university students. But Giorgio was the president of the Students' Federation at the Catholic University, and so I do know him. But what I was going to say is what's very interesting this time around is that there are candidates like Giorgio, like Camila Vallejo from the Communist Party, like a fisherman who was the leader of an uprising, in fact, in the province of Aysén in Patagonia. They cut off the country for 40 days. So these sorts of people, we have candidates running for Congress who are very different voices from the ones we've had in the past. I think that this is something that is hopeful for at least helping to push some of these reforms through. But unless there is a change in the electoral system, there isn't really going to be it's not going to be very simple to get all these reforms through.
All right, Lucia Newman, our Al Jazeera English correspondent, dodging the question like the professional she is. I'm going to see if I can drag her to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com to get her personal take on covering these elections, as she is from Chile. So thank you so much to Valentina, to Gregory, to Giorgio, to Lucia. I am taking them all to the post show. How would I say that in Spanish?
Vamos a la segunda parte del show.
Excellent. Okay. I feel like that would be a very appropriate way to end this part of the program. Just have time to tell you about Monday. We'll be looking at Mozambique. After more than 20 years of stability in the country, why have former rebels ended their peace treaty with the government? Could Mozambique be on the brink of war? Interesting questions for another week. Stay with us. The post show is next at stream.aljazeera.com. We'll see you online. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We're carrying on our look at Chile's upcoming November general elections and how student protests are impacting the campaigns. With us to talk about this, Giorgio Jackson, one of the student activists running for Congress. Gregory Alacqua is director of the Public Policy Institute in Santiago. Student leader Valentina Olivares, and also Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera correspondent, who's covering the elections. So good to see you again, Lucia. I asked you the personal question. So I want you to take your reporter's hat off for a moment. We're online, we're in the post show. I want you to be really candid if you can. What is it like covering your own country's elections for the world? What's the personal take?
Well, sure. It's extremely exciting. For me, it is. I mean, each election here, you know, hits me personally. I mean, I'm going to go out and vote. I'm not going to tell you who I'm going to vote for. But to me, it makes a huge an impact on me personally, emotionally. I was here when the coup took place. I remember that for 17 years, nobody could vote. I had relatives that were killed in the coup. So, you know, everything is and this is the 40th anniversary of that coup d'etat, by the way, this year. This election takes place on it. So it's kind of in the background of that coup and those events that we're all going to go and vote. And I hope that young people don't get disheartened and don't give up on politics. Politics is everything. We have to participate. You have to make your voice heard. It doesn't matter how old you are, but especially if you're young and if you don't like the way things are. So people like Giorgio and others, I'm sure, would agree with me. You know, we have to really go out there and try to make a difference. And if not in the ballot box, on the streets if necessary. Sure,
and when you're reporting, Lucia, there's always moments and stories and insights that you can't necessarily tell in the time that you have on our TV, in the news, in the reports that you do or the interviews you do. If there was something where you thought, I wish I could sit down and tell the public this, what would it be that you haven't had time to talk about?
Not having time to talk about are many, many things. I think I say as much as I can, but I would have liked to have done a story, for example, on the fact that although we have 3 candidates that are women in this election, 2 of them are going to be probably the top runners. Chile, according to the latest study, has the most unequal treatment of women of any country in all of Latin America, and one of the most unequal treatment of women in the world, for example. Those are things that aren't really well known, not only in Chile, but certainly internationally. I would have liked to have talked more to some of these independent candidates that aren't going to make it.
Sure.
Excuse me.
So, Lucia,
we're very well known.
Sure.
Because we don't have time to talk about them, but they're very interesting.
All right. So I'm going to let you clear your throat. Also, the music is pumping up, so it's a good time to come back to dance. No, please don't. Come back to this. Come back to the studio. Julia, community.
Yeah, our community is actually sending specific questions to our guests, and I actually have one from Jen Wilton for Valentina. And here's what Jen is asking Valentina, which is, she says, question for Valentina: will the student protest diminish if Bachelet is elected? What are the next steps for the movement? Valentina?
I think we have all answered the first question, right? It's very hard that the student strike end if Bachelet rises in the government. I think the next steps are basically the union we can create with other social movements that have raised in Chile in the past few years, right? Demanding more participation from the regions, demanding better conditions for women, demanding better work conditions, and there are several demands, may sometimes dispersed, that have been converging in great tasks. Yeah, those great tasks are the ones that I told you a few minutes ago, related to democracy and founding a new participative democracy, related to the recovery of our natural resources in a new economic model, and the recovery of basic rights. All these subjects are being widely discussed in citizenship. And taking some of Lucia's words about these new independent candidates running for the parliament and for the presidential place, I think we are going through a very special, important moment here in Chile, where there are different strategies that have been presented to the citizenship to overcome the unfair inequality and neoliberal system that has been installed since the dictatorship right now. And that is the discussion that is going to lead the social movements ahead, and that's going to pull out for major transformations.
So Valentina, let me just check that I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that the protests will continue? Do we now have a culture of students just protesting constantly? And maybe would that just undercut the value of what you're protesting about? If you're always protesting, who's going to be listening to you?
I think that that might be a risk if we're not clear enough in what is the meaning of free, public and quality education. And I would like to be precise in and I think Giorgio can comment on that, what is the student movement demanding, right? It's the financing of the offer. That means that the state can finance and guarantee public education to all of its institutions and forbid all ways of profit in primary, secondary and university education, right? Elimination of profit and the financing of the
Valentina,
office,
take a breath, because I don't want you to do a speech and I do want to have a conversation. So take a breath for a moment. So Giorgio, here's what I'm imagining. Okay, you are successful at the polls at the weekend, you take office, and then you've got students protesting for your entire tenure. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that the protests, we have to understand why are the protests. The protests are not a hobby of the students. They're because we have one of the most neoliberal systems in education. We have the more market-oriented system in education in the world. So when we're trying to change this, probably the next government will have a lot of troubles with the different interest conflicts. So we're going to need the pressure of the citizenship. So when we're calling people to the vote, we're not calling only to the vote, but into a process of the next 4 or 8 years that we for sure will be on a debate of ideas, a constant debate of ideas that need the pressure from the citizenship for these results.
Wow.
Because if we are not taking that pressure, probably the status quo will be the result.
But if someone's always shouting, when do you stop listening to them? When do you just block it out as white noise?
No, because when it's not representative, because the student movement has like 80% of support, and for sure we have a very long variety, diversity into this movement. But if the next year we have proposals from the government that doesn't fit to the expectations that people has into education reforms, probably we're going to have and we're going to need the mobilization of the citizenship.
Wow. All right, interesting. Gregory.
Yes, I just want to, one thing, I agree with Giorgio, I agree with Valentina that we do have probably the most market-oriented education system in the world. About 30% of our students go to for-profit schools in primary and secondary school funded by the government. About 20% of our students in higher education go to for-profit institutions. But what concerns me about what they're saying is we also have had tremendous success in education. Chile, according to international tests, is the country that's improved its education system the most over the last 15 years in terms of quality and in terms of equity, in terms of closing the test score gaps.
Right.
Now, we still have a long way to go, but what concerns me is we're focusing on the inputs and the processes and not as much the outcomes.
Okay, so listen, we've got to wrap up this conversation very shortly, but I want to show you something, audience who's still with us online. So this is Giorgio's website. It looks very slick, it's very modern. How do you like your website, Giorgio?
I like it a lot.
Okay.
It comes from clothes.
Yeah, of course you like your website. Why would you not like your website? What you don't have on your website, though, is a game that I am going to share with our audience. Have you seen Bash a Love on Michelle Bachelet's website? Well, basically what you do is, it's called Bash a Love. You click on it, you press the space bar, and a little chica runs through the world.
It's a little chica.
And I'm going to press the space bar to jump, and she's spreading love.
Amor.
No.
And then, yes, and then when you see a very miserable, unhappy Chilean, you double click. Let me see if I can find a miserable Chilean. Here we go.
There we go.
Spreading love, turning them into a happy person. What do you make of this? Is this Michelle Bachelet going for the youth vote? Or am I taking this too seriously here?
You're doing really well with that.
I don't really know it.
All right, I recommend you play it because what chica does not want to spread the love. And on that note, we get back to our more serious coverage of the Chilean elections. Of course, you can find that at aljazeera.com. Keep following as we follow to see how Giorgio does, how the other politicians do as we head out to the 17th of November, which is when the elections take place. Giorgio Jackson, thank you so much. Grege Elacqua, thank you for joining us. Valentina Olivares, thank you so much for giving us a youth perspective on the upcoming elections in Chile. Julio, final words from the community?
I have one question to end this one, and this is from Taylor Dalvin, who says, how will Chile progress when many still cannot agree about the rights and wrongs of the past? Hashtag Pinochet.
That conversation continues online as always, but right now, let me tell you about Monday. We'll be looking at Mozambique after more than 20 years of stability in the country. Why have former rebels ended their peace treaty with the government? Could Mozambique be on the brink of war? Important questions, but important questions for next week. In the meantime, see you online at stream.aljazeera.com, where Julio and I will be playing Mashallah. Have a great weekend.